Okay. Okay. First of all, can anyone hear me online?
Yes.
I can see. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, thank you first of all for coming in person, but also thank you everyone who's joining online. I know it's a bit of an inconvenient time Monday afternoon, but we still have some people who showed up are interested in the topic, so thank you very much. So my name is DOROTA KOŁBUK. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the UCD Earth Institute and School of Biology and Environmental Science. Earth Institute is working on many sustainability topics, and there are several, over, I believe, 170 researchers from different schools across UCD working on different approaches to sustainability, agriculture, bioeconomy, and other topics that are very relevant to us right now. And one of the projects that is important, or actually several projects that are important, are related to marine environments. And I work on one of them. So I'll be talking briefly about that said project, which is called MARBEFES. So let me just share a presentation with you all. Okay, slideshow. Okay, I think we can see it all. So the topic of my work is ecological valuation or ecological value of biodiversity and habitats in the Irish Sea. And the project, sorry, no, okay, oh, nice. Yep. So the project I'm working on is called MARBEFES. It stands for Marine Biodiversity and Ecosystem Functioning Leading to Ecosystem Services. Some of you might be familiar with the name ecosystem services if you've heard probably about natural capital accounting and topics like that. But in very broad terms, ecosystem services kind of refer to like benefits that humans get from the natural environment. In our case, we are focusing on marine and coastal ecosystems. So the aim of the project is to kind of find those ways and those links between biodiversity and goods and services provided by marine and coastal ecosystems. It's a 4-year European Union funded project. It involves multiple partners across Europe, and we are developing a set of tools. Some of them are strictly biological, but some of them are kind of interdisciplinary, focus more on like social, cultural approaches, economic approaches, kind of create this integrated way of assessing the state of the ecosystem. We are obviously relying on input from stakeholders in our areas of research. So that could be anyone pretty much from NGO or government or just interested public or industries, etc., that have something to say about the Irish Sea. Our testing grounds are kind of like the areas where we test those tools. There are 12 of them across Europe, so kind of spanning from the Arctic to Mediterranean. Here we are focusing on the Irish Sea. So like I said, there are several approaches, several biological, economic, and sociocultural tools that kind of come together to answer the question how these components interact within the sea and what should be the priorities for marine conservation and governance. Obviously, it's kind of project in early stages, so we are still kind of trying to figure out how to develop those methods, how to test those protocols, what is working, what is not working. So it's a lot of iterations in that process in the creation. So obviously, we're also relying on input from stakeholders and running stakeholder consultations and asking people what do they think about the environment, what do they consider as important. It could be biodiversity, but they also can notice things like pollution or development of like different activities in the area, and how will they interact with each other, and how do these people perceive these changes. So my focus is on the ecological part of the valuation, which is a non-monetary method. It's called ecological value assessment in the project, but the methods have been developed about 15 years ago or so as biological valuation or biological value assessment. But for the purposes of the project, the protocol has been kind of adapted and refined. So in broad terms, it's kind of assigning the ecological value. So it's kind of a metric, it's kind of like an index, basically, which integrates the inherent value of the ecosystem qualities within. So by that, we mean that we are excluding the anthropocentric approach. We are not assessing things like litter, pollution, or anything like that. We are just focusing on the biodiversity that we have right now and the habitats that we have right now in the sea. And at its core, it's a spatial assessment. So we are just basically are using maps and associated codes and spreadsheets and whatnot to calculate those values. And so what do we mean by ecological value in that case? For this protocol, two main criteria are used. We are using rarity. So basically we are answering the question, are there any, and if so, how many of unique, rare, or distinct species or habitats for which no alternatives exist? So we are looking at different scales. We are looking at local distribution of species, or regional or national. And we're trying to figure out, are there any species of like particular rarity in this area? And the other question, it's kind of, it's big, maybe a bit of a big word, aggregation fitness consequences. But basically with that, we are trying to answer what if we have an area, what could be the reason some species kind of accumulate in that area? Is this an area of particular importance, like in the sense of ecological functions? So is this a breeding area or a feeding area, or maybe important for some migratory species, etc.? So basically, yeah. So that's pretty much the two main criteria. And like I said, it's a spatial assessment. So we are basically dividing the area into little into a grid. These are little hexagons, but could be done differently. And we are intersecting it with the observed data that we have that has been collected over the years from different institutions like Marine Institute or CFAS in the case of the UK, and much more. And we are assigning that data to each cell. So it's pretty simple. But the next step is a bit more complicated. So for each of those several cells across the sea, we are answering a set of questions that are relating to ecological value. So we are asking about rarity and aggregation fitness properties. So for instance, we have a set of questions, and one of them could be, are there present any rare species locally in the area or nationally in the area? Is there a particular prevalence of certain species in the area, or it's more like homogeneous in that particular area? Are there any ecologically significant species? And by that, we mean something that's kind of irreplaceable, really. So for instance, sand eels are a very important part of the trophic chain they constitute the diet of many seabirds, for instance, puffins, and they are very hard to be replaced. Are there any habitat-forming species, such as blue mussels or honeycomb worms? Are there any symbiotic species, and so on and so on? And obviously, as with any kind of valuation or assessment that we provide, we should also be able to say how much trust we put in it, because we can put a number, but it's not going to say much. If we don't also add information like how much do we trust in it, because it's just really, those are just really numbers, but do we kind of believe them, and can we show them to policymakers? So in this third step, we are also assessing confidence. This is done based on data availability and reliability of data. So for instance, did we use monitoring or sampling data, or did we use models? How much data was available? How many questions from the previous phase we answered? Maybe it was impossible for some components. Maybe we didn't have exact abundance data, only some kind of presence and things like that. And it's also affecting our trust in the results. So an output could look something like that. To be fair, we are kind of at testing stages, so the protocol is still being refined and algorithm needs to be tested out. But basically, with our input can be something like that. This is a benthic habitat maps from EMODNet, from European sources. And we end up with some kind of spatial assessment of those habitats and associated confidence score. And this kind of tells us, in a way, kind of the importance or the irreplaceability or ecologically, the importance of ecological functions in the area. Are they more prevalent or higher in certain areas than the others? So obviously, as with any method that involves collecting data, it's one of the biggest challenges to have a good coverage of data in a large area. We are kind of spreading, we have kind of a high coverage between Ireland and the UK, and obviously there will be gaps. So this is something unavoidable, but it is what it is. So there are kind of discussions, is it better to use monitoring data or species distribution models, but in that case, it's going to affect our confidence, and also which species are we really going to choose in that case. So that's one of the challenges of the methods. As for the benefits and potential applications, so I said that this method is non-monetary, but its inputs and outputs could be included in further analysis. We could run map ecosystem services. It could be helpful with physical natural capital accounting. It could give us some information about extent and, importantly, condition of the ecosystem, and also support some information for calculations of stocks and flows and whatnot in economy. It could also be useful, I believe, in some other areas that are being tested for kind of comparison in time series. So for instance, say something has been built, like an offshore structure, a wind farm, something like that in the sea, and you can kind of use your data to compare the state of the environment pre and post building of such structure. But like I said, it's kind of tested out, and it probably is best to be done on kind of smaller areas. But anyway, the biggest challenge, I guess, but also an opportunity, is the integration with other methods of marine management. So with the economic methods and sociocultural methods. And this is something that is definitely being very vividly discussed in the project. So that's pretty much it. But this is really a glimpse into what's happening on the biodiversity side or the natural sciences side. If you want to know more about like other methods, like I don't know, eDNA, trade-based methods or whatnot, or ecosystem services, because some of them maybe are relevant to your work, to what you're doing, just please reach out. We are absolutely running stakeholder consultations very soon. So we are always curious to hear about what people think, if methods are going to be useful to their work. Okay, that's pretty much it. Thank you very much. I will stop sharing now.
Okay, thank you, Virginia. Now, our next speaker is Dr. Valentina Di Gennaro. This was online, is that right?
Yes.
From the School of Environmental Sciences at the University of East Anglia. Now, Dr. Di Gennaro is an environmental economist, and we'll talk about the methods of ecosystem valuations.
Okay. And then she has shared this. And you will
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
It's a bit weird because I cannot see you, and but thank you for the invite, and thanks for having me. I'm very happy to be here, and I'm very happy also because I spent last month a couple of time in Dublin, and I took this beautiful picture that I really wanted to put in my presentation, and I will focus my presentation mainly will focus on the economic insight of the assessment of the marine environment. And I'm an environmental economist, and I'm a postdoc, and I'm based at the University of East Anglia in southeast of England. And I'm also a member of CSERG, which is the Center for Social and Economic Research on the Global Environment. And I'm working with Dorota and ASHLEY on MARBEFES project. And as Dorota already said, we are trying to develop several tools and methods to value the marine ecosystem in different area of the Europe, using different perspectives. So Dorota talked about the ecological. I'm more focused on the economic valuation, and ASHLEY, that will talk later, is working on the sociocultural aspect. And in this project, my feeling, I have the opportunity to work with other people with a different background, so mainly marine scientists, biologists, ecologists, and it's really nice to see that they have different research questions, like how much the turbines impact on carbon cycling, or what is the best indicator for seabird biodiversity, and other like another interesting question was that I discovered was what is the impact of the wind farm to the behavior of fish. And then there are other people like policymakers, NGOs, that of course they have other perspectives, and they have other questions. So, for example, what is the impact on the fishing industry, or what is the social impact on the coastal community, for example, in case of extending on marine protected area, or to build an offshore wind farm, and so on. And of course, these questions need an answer, and needs also to communicate, also because we need to assess the marine environment in a multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary way. And this is complex. So one tool that I think we have and help in this communication is the economic valuation. And I think that when we talk about economic value, sometimes there is a misunderstanding of what we environmental economists means with economic value. Because when we talk about economic value, all people always think about profit, financial profit, or finance, business, but the environmental valuation is part of economics. But what is economics? Economics is the science which studies human behaviors, has a relationship with ends and scarce means which have alternative uses. So this is a very old definition, and in other words, we can say that economics is the study of how people make choices under condition of scarcity, and what is the results of these choices on the society. And what about the marine environment, the environment in general? if we don't have information about the environment, how we can make a better choice. So in this case, the economic valuation help us to give information about what we can choose in future and how to better manage these resources. And so the environmental valuation, if we think about, because I forgot to say that these environmental resources do not have a price. So this is make our assessment harder, and sometimes we can we can also forget about the existence of these resources. I mean, the environment are public goods. We don't pay for it. So for us, is not something that we need to think about. And so the economic valuation is a tool that help to internalize these resources into decision making by estimating a monetary value. And some example of what or how we can use the value of the environment is, for example, if we think about tourist tax or entrance fee for marine area, maybe when some area are becoming very crowded because of tourism, or just to raise awareness of the nature and the marine environment. So just to help and call the attention on the value of the nature in our life. So some people may relate better to values expressed in monetary terms, so in euros, rather than using the scientific information. Or another way, another case when we can use the environmental valuation is when there is a natural disaster and a natural damage, and we need to understand and quantify the impact of this natural disaster and do a damage assessment. Or another example is the environmental accounting, or also called the natural capital accounting. In MARBEFES, we are the only project at a European level that we are working on the marine natural capital accounting. What is the marine natural capital accounting? Is a relative new topic, and is new because the guideline at worldwide and the European level are pretty new, and the idea is to record and to monitoring the contribution of the nature, and for example in our project of the marine ecosystem, to the economy. For example, we are trying to understand what is the impact of the seagrass habitat, for example, on the tourism sector, or what is the impact of a healthy marine ecosystem for the fishery sector. What means? So what we can do if we have this information and we say, okay, there is a link between the health of the marine environment and the economy, so the fishery or the tourism sector, and how we can better manage these the trade-off about the marine ecosystem. And the economic valuation, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the concept of ecosystem services, but the economic valuation is based on the concept of ecosystem services, and is something that environmental economists use to link the ecosystem, so in this case the marine ecosystem, to the goods and benefit that from the consumption increase our welfare, our well-being, or satisfaction, if we want to call in another way. And the ecosystem services are in the middle, so we can have the intermediate ecosystem services that are basically what the ecologists call the ecological functioning. So is what the ecosystem actually does, so what the ecosystem provides. And the final ecosystem services that are the results of this ecological process that then provide goods and benefit to us. So this framework is very anthropocentric compared to the ecological perspective. And for example, here we have some example of ecosystem services that can be the provisioning ecosystem services, like the fish, and we consume fish, we eat fish, so this increase our well-being in terms of food, or regulating ecosystem services. So let's think about the carbon sequestration, which help the climate regulation, and at the end we have an healthy climate. Or there are some cultural ecosystem services. These are more related to the tourism, contact with the nature, activity in the nature. And one very important thing is that economic value makes sense only when we talk about the relationship between us and the environment. So it's a very, again, anthropocentric approach. And of course, what we call the total economic value can refer to an use value. For example, when we go for a swim, or for a walk on the beach, or can be an option value. So we can assess the option. So it's not related to the use of the marine environment, but is more related to the possibility. So in future, I might use this ecosystem. So for this reason, there is a value. Or we can refer to non-use value. If we think about not our relationship with the nature, but the relationship that the other people, or the satisfaction that other people might have in also for future generation. This is a more about the altruistic value. And there is another type of value that is the existence value. So we know that the coral reef is very important for the environment. So just for this, we can value this. And for each of these type of value, we have a technique, so a specific methodology. And the two main branch of this are the valuation approach that are based more on survey and preferences of people, and price approaching that are more related to cost and market observation. And for example, this kind of approach are very consistent with the natural capital accounting, because they are consistent with the way in which the main economic indicator, the GDP, is computed. And so we must use in this area this kind of technique to be consistent with the economic valuation. And sometimes we, to assess the marine environment, at the end, we need to just multiply a quantity and a price. But we know that behind this number, there are a lot of work to do. For the quantity part, there is a mapping, sampling of the environment, modeling, for example. And also for the economic part, there are a lot of data gathering, data collection, statistics that make this economic value reliable. And so I will conclude, say that I hope that my message is assess the marine environment using the economic valuation doesn't mean just put a value on the marine environment, but is something that we do to have to help to have more an amount of and quality of the information that can we use in the decision making process for hopefully a better management of this important resource. Thank you.
Today's speaker is Dr. ASHLEY CAHILLANE, from the UCD Earth Institute and the UCD School of English, Drama and Film. Dr. CAHILLANE is going to look at the socio-cultural aspects of marine biodiversity. Thanks, Joe.
I'll just open your slides.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you'll probably need them.
Yeah, hi everyone, in person and online. Thanks a million, Joe, and thanks to Rasha for the invitation. So I am a postdoctoral researcher here at University College Dublin, and I work in the environmental humanities. So that's an emerging field that brings together different disciplines from the humanities, like philosophy, English literature, which is my home discipline, and politics, ethics, history. Oh, thank you. Yeah, to investigate questions of meaning, culture, politics, ethics as they underpin environmental issues. So that's the reason I've kind of been brought into the MARBEFES project. So as it's been said, I work on MARBEFES as well. So I work with DOROTA, and she looks at the ecological value of the marine environment. And I work with Valentina, who just spoke, and she looks at the economic value. And I look at the social and cultural value of the marine environment. Sorry, now how do I?
Those.
These ones, yeah.
Little.
Oh, you have to
Turn
turn
on.
it off.
Yeah.
All right. I can move it from the computer, maybe. We can just look at Ireland's eye there. And just go like that.
Oh, it's only that thing that's working. Only the red thing is working.
It's okay for now. I can just see that. Just do
Yeah.
that, and then you can
Perfect.
peek and I'll fix it.
Yeah. Right. So yeah, so
Just
I
like that.
measure social and cultural benefits that humans get from the environment. So that means things like sense of place, traditions, cultural heritage, artistic inspiration, community, and things like religious and spiritual value as well. So this is about how environments underpin how people derive meaning and emotion from their interactions with ecosystems. The idea is to ensure that these types of social and cultural benefits can be considered and protected in policy. MARBEFES uses the ecosystem services framework, which we've kind of heard about. So that just looks at how matching ecosystems with the benefits that they provide to humans in terms of economic, ecological, and social and cultural value. A big reason for studying these types of values, the social and cultural ones, is to kind of understand how social and cultural health is intertwined with environmental health. So that's one of the kind of key motivations for my research anyway. So it's to give an example, there's been a bit of research done on how decline in fish species and fishing industries in the Irish Sea from ecological forces, but also economic, political, regulatory forces, can impact kind of mental health and cultural heritage of fishing communities. So environmental pressures like erosion, obviously yes, still the same side. Erosion, climate change, and species decline doesn't just affect ecological health, but it degrades sense of place as well. So, you know, there's been studies done on with fishing communities, if they cannot go out on boats in the same way or as much, and that can really disrupt their equilibrium and a loss of a culture. Also frustrations around maybe feeling a lack of voice and decision making. So some of the researchers who look at these social and cultural dimensions would argue for more inclusion of fishermen and women in policy and decision making, more investment in celebrating and understanding fishing cultural heritage. So that's just one example of why it would be necessary to look at this kind of value. Next slide, please. So kind of to think about how does the Irish Sea specifically enrich social and cultural life? So the Irish Sea social or cultural heritage is quite rich and diverse. We have coastal cats, we have festivals, we have cultural heritage sites. It has inspired literary and artistic figures. But for this kind of short talk, I want to focus on one aspect of the Irish Sea, which is really important for social and cultural value, but mightn't be seen as so. And that's the fact that the sea can be quite rough sometimes and dangerous, as with most marine environments. But the Irish Sea is a shallow sea. It has cold currents coming in from the Atlantic. It has wind variability, and that means that winds and tides can kick up quite quickly, and it can be quite dangerous. As well, the Irish Sea, it's kind of known as a bit of a noisy sea. I don't know if people have heard of that. There's a phrase as unquiet as the Irish Sea. I don't know, has anyone heard of that? I've heard of it in my work, but I recently got to talk to a submariner, so somebody who goes underground on submarines,
And he said the Irish Sea is very noisy under the water because of all the trade and the ferrying that happens there. So it is quite a busy sea. So even if it ecologically can be rough at times, not always, it's also quite busy. So it can be a dangerous place. But it's important to engage with all aspects of the sea and all aspects of our cultural heritage, not just the kind of romantic, picturesque seaside view. There's cultural heritage involved in danger and rough tides as well, and rough weather. So as I mentioned, I'm a literary studies scholar, so I tend to go to literature first, and then I go to the more social sciences approaches of interviews and focus groups and stuff. So there's been really interesting work done on roughness in the Irish Sea. So, for example, Claire Connolly in University College Cork has looked at how British colonisation of Ireland actually transformed literary responses to the sea. And this was because crossing the Irish Sea gained a lot more importance during colonial times for either elites coming over to improve their financial standing, their political standing through settler colonialism, but also just ordinary people looking for financial opportunities, work, freedom in different ways. So there was more people actually crossing the sea. And what she found in the literature, like novels, plays, poems, but also people's diaries, media, was that there was a lot of writing about the roughness of the Irish Sea, in particular, a lot of imagery around it, of angry tides and angry winds. But that was a way to communicate the kind of material and emotional difficulties of different crossings in life, not just actual sea crossings. So the roughness of the Irish Sea is actually very prominent in our cultural heritage as well. And another scholar, there at the guy at the bottom of the slide, John Brannigan, he works here at University College Dublin. Now he's on the MARBEFES project as well, and he's actually my line manager here. But he's looked at literature as well, and he has looked specifically at literature from the 20th century. So kind of modernist Irish writers like James Joyce, Evan Boland, W.B. Yeats. And he's kind of argued that in the 20th century, a lot of writers engaged with difficult heritages of drownings and shipwrecks in the Irish Sea as well. We have a strong cultural heritage of shipwrecks in the Irish Sea, and a lot of that has been kind of mapped by the Marine Institute and different projects. But literature has engaged in that in a strong way. And to kind of engage with the whole spectrum of our relationship to the natural world. Again, not just the kind of picturesque parts. So Brannigan has talked about how, especially from the writers who write from the perspective of Dublin Bay, engaging with shipwrecks is a way of thinking about how Dublin City and its port is inseparable from the history of shipwrecks and drowning. And that it reflects like prompts thinking about limits and ecological limits, I guess back to what Joe kind of said at the beginning of our session, thinking about our place in the world in relation to environmental and ecological limits. So obviously danger is not something to kind of embrace with open arms. You have to be careful as well, but it is something that can be thought through, and you don't have to always shy away from it. And in my work, talking to different communities and interviews, focus groups, surveys, the danger of the sea comes up as well, and I'll be talking a little bit more about that later on. We just say another thing that has happened in the literature is that writers would engage with what John Brannigan says, quote, the violence of seaborne modernity. That's the second quote there. And just a little bit, again, thinking about the Irish Sea as an economic space as well. You know, different sea spaces are really at the root of globalization as well. There's a lot of humanities researchers who've talked about that. There's stuff that happens with trade and travel that really underpins our global economic system, our global travel system and culture. And it's often out of sight, out of mind, but literature really gets at that as well. And you can kind of think through that cultural heritage as well. It's not something to just be avoided. But just, sorry, I realized I forgot to read out the quote at the top of the slide here. This again was Claire Connolly looking at literature about the Irish Sea. And she says, quote, to consider sea crossings in Irish culture is to encounter both certainty, enduring environmental realities experienced over centuries, and unpredictability, as weather events set plans awry and make haphazard work of history. end quote. So again, this kind of gets at this idea of thinking about difficult environments, difficult places, difficult seas and histories as a way of understanding a dynamic between kind of certainty, the long-term ecological knowledge that can build up in a place, long-term relationships that people can have in a place, but also realizing that there's human vulnerability to the elements as well. Right, is okay. Yeah, thanks.
I think you can do it yourself if you want to.
Oh yeah, thanks, Jeremy. So my research with MARBEFES, I tried to look at relationships between humans and the natural world and think about how it's actually relationships and interactions between humans and their environments in individual and collective ways that underpin this ability to get cultural value and social value like sense of place, traditions, literature. So we use the ecosystem services framework, but historically that can frame a relationship with the human world in a one-way dynamic where nature and ecology provides humans with benefits that enriches human life, and isn't that wonderful that we can just take from the environment. But there's a lot more interest now in policy making, in environmental politics, in the general public. It seems to be increasing interest to really see our relationship with the natural world in a more dynamic way, in a more two-way process, even if there are uneven relationships where humans may exploit or take more from the environment, but to understand that it needs to be seen as a two-way process. So we're going to be measuring this value that humans get from the environment. We need to understand how humans have the capacity to influence the environment as well, and maybe have a sense of responsibility in that capacity. So I really enjoy working with this framework by scholars Robert Fish, Andrew Church, and Michael Winter, and they define social and cultural value from environments as, quote, relational processes and entities that people actively create and express through interactions with ecosystems, end quote. So it's a bit more focusing on the relationships that underpin the ability to get value from the environment, rather than just measuring the actual value that we get, as a way of shifting to a bit more of an ecocentric perspective. So the diagram on the right there, these scholars have provided. I know the writing's really small, you don't have to read that, but that's just to kind of show that we're looking at two-way flows of value between humans and the environment. So up at the top there, it talks about cultural values, the ways that the norms and expectations influencing and influenced by services, benefits. Sorry, I can't even read it myself. But anyways, up at the top, this is how humans get cultural value from the environment. So at the top, you have the biophysical domain, like the material components of the environment that kind of feeds down into cultural practices like stewarding the environment, fishing, creating art about the environment. But that creates spaces and relationships that create the conditions to actually get these values like sense of place and things like that. And crucially, what they're kind of arguing is that when people get a sense of place and get value from the marine environment, that can also influence stewardship, practices of environmental care and responsibility back towards the environment to create the conditions to get the value from it back again. It doesn't always happen, there's still a lot of exploitation, but it does happen in some cases, and we need to focus on that more. So in my research, I've kind of done, I've employed a lot of methods like DOROTA and VALENTINA, where I have been working with stakeholders, showcasing them our methods, asking what do you think, but also just directly asking people and studying social perceptions, asking people like, what is your relationship with the environment? How do you use it? What value do you get from it? What value do you think different communities, human communities, get from it? Just in the, and I've been kind of talking to people around coastal areas of the Irish Sea, especially Dublin Bay, because it's local to us here, but also Morecambe Bay to get the other side of the Irish Sea. So Morecambe Bay is on the northwest coast of England. But yeah, and we try to engage with a diversity of stakeholders as well. So people who work in conservation, fishing, cultural heritage, the arts and culture, local authorities, to kind of get a diversity. But just in the interest of time, for this short talk, I'm going to talk about one study that I've done, and it's a bit more of an unusual one. It was kind of a a bit of a kind of experimental study. So I was able to join a group of scientists for a research cruise last autumn. So we went out for a week. It was fabulous. And we got very lucky with the weather because that doesn't always happen. And I was able to interview and observe the scientists and the crew. And the crew were, a lot of them were ex-fishermen or current fishermen or merchant sailors. And I was able to study their relationship with the sea and ask them about working in an offshore environment. So we did in-depth interviews. I did interviews with 15 different people on the ship. And I also had 23 participants where we did more informal conversations, and I actually was able to just observe them for the week as they were working on the ship doing the science. They were mapping the seabed, actually, but then just the crew kind of doing the ship operations. And also the interviews happened in situ. So like on the ship, so I was able to capture immediate responses to the environment, and it was immediate responses to the sea, but it was actually more about being on a ship, because obviously if you're at sea, just yourself as a body, you're dead, like, so you have to be on a ship. So it was a bit more about kind of what it's like being on a ship at sea. And yeah, and I guess it did help to invite in that eco-centric approach a little bit more, me being actually on the ship, doing the interviews on the ship, instead of asking people on shore, what's your relationship to the sea, what's it like working offshore, how might it contribute to social and cultural health and well-being. And I was experiencing that unpredictability. Nerves, what's the weather going to be like today? Are we going to be seasick? Is the technology going to work? There's a lot of unpredictability, and I was able to experience that myself while talking about it with people on board. So a big thing that came up in the interviews was a sense of respect for the sea. That was the number one thing that came up in the interviews, in informal chats, and in my actual experience for the week on the ship. People said, you need to respect the sea. And this was grounded in lived experience. And it was spoken with real conviction and empathy, like across the board. So the people I had been talking to had spent years offshore, and a lot of them were from coastal communities. A lot of them did sea swimming, surfing. They've had years and years of experience with the sea, or with the sea from a coastal environment. And some of them, a lot of them were from generations of sailors, fishermen as well. So they spoke about, a lot of them spoke about the sea's full range. So how it can go from calm to unpredictability, and how it can be a dangerous space as well. And that really came up as well. And that informed this sense of respect for the sea that they were talking about, and that I detected. So one of the participants said, quote, "The power is tranquil and treacherous," end quote. And another one, when I asked what's it like working offshore, he just said it's great and it's horrible. So it's great when the weather is nice, it's horrible when the weather is not so nice. Sorry, am I doing all right for time? Or? Thanks. I'm just gonna check my notes, just make sure I get this kind of right and don't misrepresent people. Yeah, so I kind of wanted to develop, so I'm really interested in this sense of respect for the sea that people actively themselves were saying. And I have to think about how is this a benefit to people? So it's not just a nice thing to be respectful of the sea, but how can this enhance social and cultural well-being? How is this a benefit that the environment can actually provide to people by giving them that sense of respect? Because it did seem to benefit people, and it was a strong sense of people's identity, humility, and contentedness, I guess. So I turned to kind of theory, which I'm an environmental humanist. We look at a lot of theory and environmental philosophy. And so the environmental feminist Val Plumwood, sorry now, nearly done. Yeah, she argues that respect for nature comes from recognizing its complexity, power, and the limits of human control. So she advocates for, quote, "remaking our relations with nature and beings in nature on the basis of recognizing them not as things, but as creative, self-directed, originative others," end quote. And this recognition, she suggests, often emerges when nature reveals its complexity directly. So for those I interviewed, I think this insight came through their lived experience with the sea. So although they acknowledged its dangers and downsides, they spoke about it with profound love and appreciation. So as a way of kind of investigating this further, I've drawn on studies of sea swimming and surfing as a way of thinking about social embodied experiences offshore. Now, I'm a little bit different because I'm thinking about being on a ship environment and how that creates social value. But there are some relationships between people who swim and surf, which I'm sure a lot of you do or have done, and how that kind of contributes to your emotional, cultural, psychological health. So in the kind of studies about sea swimming and surfing, by scholars like E.C. Britton and Roland Foley, they talk about how participants, again, they do interviews in situ in actually swimming with people and trying to observe people as they're talking to them. And what emerges is this fluid and dynamic sense of place. So sense of place is a key benefit that you can kind of get from marine environment, but in blue space, it can often be characterized as fluid and dynamic. So that's, again, the unpredictability comes in. The attunement to seasonal rhythms, whether it's longer term or short term, just like something that could change in a flash. And it's that changeability and that movement that actually conditions your sense of place and your psychological equilibrium. So that came up on the ship as well. So one participant described being offshore as, quote, I suppose it's being like a gambler. There's a lot that can go wrong. It's extremely frustrating at times. Nothing ever goes entirely according to plan, but there's a real buzz when things do work out well. Plus, I mean, you get to spend time in absolutely amazing places. I mean, just the opportunity to be out here, and there's not many of us that get the opportunity, end quote. So the sense of challenge and unpredictability was actually a gain from being in an offshore environment, and this came up multiple times as well. So yeah, it was this dynamic between challenge and unpredictability, but also a sense of privilege and awe through proximity to the natural world. And that's a big benefit of marine environments. A lot of people talk about this sense of feeling a connection to nature. Yeah, so the challenges and the difficulties of being offshore and when you're sea swimming or surfing is actually part of the appeal as well. That ability to meet challenges, and that contributes to increased self-confidence, identity, sense of self, sense of agency and power. So yeah, I'm nearly done. The participant here was right to point out that this is a privilege as well, and that not everyone gets the opportunity for this as well. It is a massive privilege, and in our current economic system, not everybody has the opportunity to get out on a boat. But when I talked to the fishermen on the ship and some of the people who had spent a long time out on the ship, they expressed a desire to want to always be able to access the boat by ship for some of these reasons. It's really part of their routine, their sense of self, their cultural heritage, their parents did it. And it was under question because some of them have experienced turbulent times with changes happening in the fishing industry, economic ruptures like the 2008 economic recession. There was a bit of a fear around being able to access the sea through a ship. So that did get me thinking a little bit about how this sense of place offshore needs to be considered in policy and governance as well. So that's kind of my last slide. How do we think of sense of place and cultural heritage in terms of policy and decision making? So that's ultimately what I have to try and do with MARBEFES. I haven't gone around to figuring that out yet, but I have thought about it a little bit. So these are more questions and provocations, I guess, and as the research progresses, we'll hopefully get to it a bit more. But one thing I think is that policy and decision makers need to think about when there comes to policies around marine protected areas and conservation, offshore industries, offshore wind or energy, fishing. Think about, are these policies going to adversely affect people's ability to get offshore and to get out on boats into specific areas? Is that going to affect their culture, their sense of self, their identity, as well as maybe livelihoods, economic livelihoods, broader cultural legacies? Not that that means you don't do these kinds of conservation or economic policies, but that try to avoid adverse cultural losses if possible, and where they might occur, maybe compensate people or provide extra support, like the investment in celebrating and preserving fishing cultural heritage. Another thing policymakers can do is try to enhance and nurture a sense of place and community, offshore and onshore, through policies like thinking about the physical space, how do you enhance sense of place in a physical safe space through science, through design, through the built environment, through initiatives and activities that bring people together, share experiences, and enhance sense of place and connection to an understanding of the natural world. So policies around that. And as the last thing, sense of place and the cultural aspect can be a way to foster common interests and mutual respect among diverse groups when bringing them together, whether it's people from fishing, conservation, research, local community residents. So yeah, I've probably gone on too long there, but thanks.
Now, our last speaker today is Dr. Thomas BUITENDIJK. Thomas, you going to come? From ICRAN and the UCD School of Business, right? When you are described as a blue and I suppose that means sea.
Yeah.
And environmental humanities researcher working with coastal communities to understand the cultural value of the landscape and the impact of climate change and the energy transition.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
I need to do anything?
Yes, I'll give that, and I will put up the slides for you now.
Hi everyone, my name is Thomas. I'm a researcher. I spend a lot of my time across different research institutes. So I'm not part of MARBEFES, but I am based at the UCD Earth Institute, just like ASHLEY and DOROTA. And I'm the coordinator of the MESSAGE, which is an interdisciplinary research group which tries to bring humanities and social science perspectives to sort of natural scientific research challenges in coastal marine and energy context. So we really try to put the work that DOROTA, ASHLEY, myself, others do that has to do with the cultural and the social aspects of marine environments and energy transitions to bring that to the table when there are big conversations between different researchers, especially natural science researchers as well. So we try to bring that perspective. And I also work at ICRAC, which is the SFI Research Centre in Applied Geosciences. So that's really a place where pretty much everyone is a geoscientist, except for me and a couple of others. But we try to bring that social science humanities perspective to some of the work they do. And I'm currently in the College of Business, but last year I was in the School of Earth Sciences. The year before that was in the School of Biology, and the year before that in the School of English. So it really doesn't really mean anything anymore. It just shows that I move around a lot, trying to do this kind of work. I'm trying to bring that sort of humanities perspective, if you will, to that kind of work. I'm going to be talking today about a project that's finished. So at the moment I work on a big horizon project as well. It's called Blue4All, but that's ongoing research, and I figured I'd bring you something that's finished and that actually forms the basis of what I'm doing at the moment. So the project's called Taking Stock. And Taking Stock was a research project that we finished last year. And it was a research project that was about marine sediment storing carbon. Now you might have no idea what marine sediment storing carbon are. I had no idea when I started this research. Effectively, what we were doing is, can I use the pointer? Yeah, great. So in the National Marine Planning Framework, the Irish government identified a number of areas around the Irish coast with very large accumulations of sediments, of carbon in sediment. So basically organic carbon that just sits on the seabed and accumulates over time. So you can see the very dark areas, this further offshore, but here Galway Bay, parts of Cork, and there Dundalk Bay is an especially dark area. Basically what that means is there's a very, very large amount of organic carbon on the seabed, and it should stay there, because if you disturb that, it activates biological activity and it could potentially be remineralized, which means CO2, it goes up in the air as CO2. And that's the last thing you want, because it would add to what we already have, a huge problem of climate change. So it's known as a type of blue carbon. And as long as it's stored in those kind of really big stores of sediments, it's fine. But there are loads of questions around this. One, we don't know how much there is. We don't know exactly where it is. And we don't really know what happens if it's disturbed. We don't really know if it immediately goes up in the air or that it kind of settles down again. We know some of it goes back up in the air, but we don't know exactly how much. So there are teams of researchers working on that. And in ICRAC, in my research institute, there is a big project funded by the Marine Institute where they actually go to places like Galway Bay and Dundalk Bay on the research vessels. So when ASHLEY went last year, everybody else on the boat was now you're doing really important work at it. But my boss was on that boat as well doing taking a course of sediments. So ASHLEY probably would have interviewed him and a number of others. And they were taking course of sediment to see how much carbon is there in the sediment and has it changed over time. But when they got that money, they were told, look, Dundalk Bay, for instance, is an extremely busy area, which Ashley was talking about this. There are loads of social, cultural, economic, etc. uses of marine spaces. And there is huge potential for something like this to cause concern, because here is yet another thing that potentially we have to worry about in marine environments. And that could upset a lot of activity. Maybe the fisheries that happen in particular places are not good for these kind of sediments. So what do you do then? Do you say we stop all the fishing activity and we protect the sediments at all costs? Or we say the fisheries have been there for such a long time, they're under so much pressure already, we need to protect them? Do we try to find a balance, etc.? So when they got the money, they were told you should probably look into this as well. Maybe you should engage with communities on this new topic. Like, what do they think is going on there? What are people's own ideas about what's the sediments, how much carbon is in there, and what should be done? Because only if you get the communities involved can you actually move towards sort of a type of marine spatial planning that's equitable and inclusive, meaning that everybody gets to say, and there are no, you try to create as many winners as possible and not just let people left behind, right? So that's what I did as part of the Taking Stock project. And we focused on Dundalk Bay, and I'll go into that a little bit more in a second. But the aim was to go talk to people in Dundalk Bay or around Dundalk Bay, not necessarily in Dundalk Bay, but communities around Dundalk Bay, asking, starting with very similar questions as Ashley. Ashley has a very similar background to me, so I also have a background in English. I've kind of turned more into a marine social scientist now, but we ask the same types of questions. So asking, what does the landscape mean to you? What's your relationship with the landscape? What do you do when you go there? And then building on that, saying, here's this new topic. What are your ideas about this? What are the concerns about this? And what are your priorities for the management of sediments in the future? But there's lots of questions around this. Well, the main question I kept getting was, how are you going to do a perception study of something nobody has ever heard of before? Which is a good question. It's a relatively new topic of interest. So how can you go to the public and say, what do you think of marine sediment storing carbon? If the main response you're probably going to get is, what do I think of what? So that's a question. That being said, and there are loads of knowledge gaps. So that research team at ICRAC is still doing the research. They don't actually have the answers yet. So there's more unknowns than knowns. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't have the conversation, because the risk then is that you wait until you have all the answers and then you've probably already made the decision. And then you go to the community and you say, you know what, we've made this decision on sediments, and here's what we're going to do. And then you've skipped the entire period of community consultation. And you've also overlooked a lot of local knowledge. And it's also not true that people don't have an opinion on something they don't. One, they might actually know about these things. And two, people can care about environments that they don't know so much about. So there have been studies, for instance, this study by Conan and Van Putten have looked at perceptions of the deep sea mining, and they were saying, look, these areas are probably not so well known to people either. Let's compare them to another couple of areas where people definitely never come. Antarctica, the moon, remote terrestrial environments, the hinterlands of Alaska. And they actually felt that people cared very strongly about these environments. So the fact that you can't go to the moon doesn't mean that you don't care about it. The fact that you don't go to the deep sea doesn't mean that you don't have an opinion on deep sea mining. And there are also other studies a little bit closer to home on sediments. These were not on sediments, but they were on subsurface hydrology. This study by Gibson et al. And the other one by Ryder et al. Was on perceptions of shale gas exploration. So things that happen under the surface, a little bit similar to sediments, but then usually onshore. And what both of those studies found was that people will have an idea or some kind of perception of what's going on, but they'll base it on what they know. So the idea being, you develop an impression of something you don't know so much about, but you refer to what you know, which is a pretty common process, right? You always build on what you know in order to kind of try to understand what's going on somewhere else. So we thought maybe that'll be the case here as well. So let's try and work with that. That being said, we also have to be careful, because one, if people don't know a lot about it, they might default to asking me. They might say, "Oh, what do you think is going on?" And that's what I don't want to, like, it's not as interesting to hear what I find, right? And I'm also not an expert on geoscience. So we had to make sure we didn't skew perception. And we wanted to try, there's no such thing as value-free science, it just doesn't exist, because you always bring your own opinions and your own decisions to something. But we wanted to come as close as possible. So the last thing I wanted to do was go do the research and ask people, what do you think is going on? And when they gave me the answer, tell them they were wrong. Because one, I don't have all the answers either. But the other part as well is it doesn't matter so much if what somebody says is 100% scientifically accurate. That matters whether people believe it, because what we believe drives our opinions on things. And then at a later stage, you can go into education, you can go into conversations, but you first have to just understand what people think is going on. So I won't go into this too much, but we decided to use the concept of speculation a little bit for this. So speculation, driving that idea of you build on what you know in order to understand what you don't know yet. And that's what we're interested in. And why were we doing this? To come back a little bit to what I said earlier, a lot of my work, and not just this project, but a lot of my work really is driven by this kind of relationship here between there's a paper here by Unanian, and she talks about communities of meaning and communities of participation. And the idea there is that communities of meaning, they're collectives of individuals. It doesn't have to be, it can be a town, but it can also be a street, a residential area, a family, whatever. People who have collective sets of meaning. So they have a relationship with a place built on what it means to the community, or built on what they did with their family holidays, say, to a particular beach. And that brings people together and gives significance to something. Once you understand what something means to people, you can then build on that to give people a say in how it's going to be used or how it's going to be managed or changed. So you can build on communities of meaning in order to enhance communities participation. So to bring it back to the essence is you have to first understand what something means to people, and then you can involve people in making decisions about it. And this really drives pretty much all of the work I do in Dundalk and elsewhere. So what we did is we did interviews, focus groups with people in Dundalk, but not just Dundalk, but sort of the entire coastal belt, all the way out to the Cooley Peninsula. And then south of Dundalk, so Blackrock, Annagassan, Salterstown, all the way to Clara Head, which is where the fishing community is largely. And we had a two-stage sort of conversation. So we started by talking about Dundalk Bay, just asking people, what does this place mean to you? What do you do when you go there? What is your relationship with Dundalk Bay, very broadly speaking? And then we talked about marine sediment storing carbon. Now, we didn't actually call it marine sediment storing carbon, because some of the feedback we got pretty early on was that a lot of people got really confused by the term. So we just said it's mud on the seabed, which is what it is. It's mud, gravel, and sand on the seabed. Marine sediment storing carbon becomes a little bit distracting as a term, because it ultimately just refers to mud on the seabed. And we had that conversation about, what do you think is going on the seabed? Do you think it's important? Is it something you're worried about? And how should it be managed? Now, very important that I led the conversations, because I have a background in English and not in geoscience. And that's actually really helpful in these conversations, because it didn't turn into a, you tell us what's going on. It didn't turn into a Q&A or a discussion. I very simply came in and said, I don't have all the answers on this. I'm not going to tell you what's going on. I can give you the very basic version of what everyone knows is going on. But other than that, it'll just be an open conversation. You can tell me what you think is going on. I'm not going to challenge you on it. I'm just here to listen. And I would also emphasize people to fill in the knowledge gaps themselves. So a lot of people had experience of fishing, of diving, of going to Dundalk Bay. So they actually knew a lot about Dundalk Bay, much more than I did. So I encouraged them to use that knowledge, right? So this is the study area. If you want to take Dundalk Bay very broadly, like very narrowly, it would just be this area. That's the Dundalk Bay Harbour limit. But if you take it a little bit more broadly, it would be pretty much this area. So say the Clara Head fishing fleet goes into Dundalk Bay as well for the prawn and the cockle fisheries. The razor clam and the cockle fisheries, sorry, that's quite inshore. That's a very shallow fisheries. And then you have the Dublin Bay prawn fisheries. Nobody, Lord knows why they're called Dublin Bay prawns, because they actually don't come from Dublin. They come from Dundalk. There are also called the Nephrops fisheries, which is one of the most profitable fisheries in Ireland. They're further offshore. So that's kind of the area we worked with. Advertised it broadly, widely. It was a general community study, so we wanted to talk to really anyone who would talk to us, and we didn't try to pre-select who we were going to talk to. So we did put it out quite broadly. We did reach out as well with targeted communications, but we also put it out quite broadly. Put it in the newspaper, go on the radio, etc. Put out a poster. And once we talked to everyone, once we got all the interviews and focus group, etc., we did thematic analysis. Thematic analysis is really just, it's a qualitative way, so working with rich text of trying to find patterns of meaning. So you're trying to, you get a huge block of data because you have hours and hours of audio recording, and you have to somehow get something out of that. So what you do is you do thematic analysis. I won't go into this too much, but what it means is over time, you're trying to identify bigger themes that emerge from throughout the data. And we did this using a collaborative approach. So it wasn't just me, it was myself and a colleague did this, and we kind of, this sort of a further stage in the process, and you're trying to build up to sort of the higher level, identify some of the themes. Now, some of the things you might be interested in, some of the things we found, first of all, Dundalk Bay, extremely valuable community space. It's very close to what Ashley said about the IRC spaces. So somebody there, I'll read the quote out, said, "I often think of my community as drawing from along the bay, if you like, the different communities, not just Dundalk town, but some of the smaller towns along the coast as well." People really emphasize the importance of striking the balance. Virtually nobody that I spoke to said, these sediments should be protected at all costs. We don't care about anything else. There's an awareness of historic economic activity in the area. There are fisheries in the area. People understand that the fishery is under pressure. And it's no solution to just squeeze out the fisheries just for the sake of protecting the sediments. So somebody here saying, for instance, I quote, "It's probably the balance of looking after the bay, particularly from a biodiversity aspect, also using it as an asset for tourism and for leisure and for the economy." So it's that balance. That being said, everybody wanted sediment management to be approached very carefully. And for instance, here, I think this is a nice, captures it well. The quote, "I think it's very valuable, both in terms of ecologically and even some of the things maybe that we don't know. Like you were saying, we don't really know about the mud, but we're trying to find out, like, why is it important? I think if you don't know, well, then you leave it until you kind of understand more about it. You don't go and destroy it and then realize, well, actually, we're after making things a whole lot worse by disturbing that." And when we're looking at speculation, which I mentioned earlier, building on what you know in order to understand what you don't know, a lot of people make the analogy to peatlands. So a lot of people would say sediments are, offshore marine sediments are kind of like peatlands. So with the peatlands for a very long time, we used them because there was a cultural tradition of digging your own peat and burning peat. And now we're starting to realize that that may have not been that such a good idea, but we didn't know that at the time. And that kind of translated now again to what people said with sediments, and some people saying we don't want to be in the same situation where we use the sediments, where we trawl and we dig and we do whatever, we dredge, and then we realize 20 years down the line we shouldn't have done that and we've made the same mistake. So that's the careful approach to sediment management. And the last thing that came up in a lot of conversations, people wanted to be involved in whatever decisions were going to be made. So the one, they wanted to learn, they wanted the answers from the scientists, but then they also wanted to be part of the conversation. So somebody saying it's critical that people feel part of any change that's going to happen in that relationship with the bay, because whatever changes you make will always impact the relationship. Some other place meaning just at the higher level. Some other findings, sorry, place meaning, I said that already, very, very significant place to people, Dundalk Bay. A lot of people had a lot of experiential knowledge of the bays. People know the sediments, they know it's a very sedimented bay. A lot of people know exactly where, what types of sediment are. So just as an exercise, we got some input during the interview from people who just started drawing on maps during the interview and said, actually, I can tell you where sediments are. Not a real bother, here's this type of sediment, there's that type of sediment, etc. When we compared that to the official database, the Infomar database, which is the Marine Institute in Galway, we found that what the people had drawn in was exactly the bit that's missing in the other map. It's called the white ribbon. Because white ribbon is the sediments that are so close to shore that a Marine Institute vessel can't go there because it would run aground. which coincidentally is exactly the part that the citizens know best because that's where they go. Which is fascinating, right? It shows, it makes a great argument for citizen science. People know what's going on in their own area. And you can put that information side by side. It was definitely a new topic for research and the public. So they said, we need to know more, we need to know more, we need to keep the conversation going. That being said, we want to be part of any future decisions that are made about this. Now, what do we do with this? I very strongly believe in the opposite of parachute science. I don't believe in going into a community, taking what you want and going out again, and never coming back. So it's, once you do this kind of research, you have to keep the conversation going. You have to go back to the community. You have to share your findings. You have to kind of involve people. So once we finished up the research, we went to Dundalk. We went back to Dundalk. We organized a community event in the library, which is particularly well attended, especially for a rainy Wednesday evening in early January. So it was actually chock-a-block. There were loads of people there. And we launched a policy brief there. So it was a sort of the shorter version of an academic paper, which you can hand out to policymakers, but also to the community. And it's a way to kind of recap what you found and make some recommendations. I have a couple of hard copies on me, but I just realized I left them in the office. That being said, it's online on the ICRAC website. If you Google ICRAC taking stock, the policy brief is right there and you can see it. We've also published this research. This is available open access by the journal. Based on what we found, and that's leads into my current work with Blue4All, we realized that people have quite strong opinions on what happens to their coastal areas and they want to be involved in future marine spatial planning. And one of the things we found was that place attachment, so your sense of attachment to a place, what it means to you, one of the main indicators, along with people's values, of how they think an area should be governed. So we figured we were doing a follow-up study, which we're just about wrapping up at the moment. And the data was collected last year, but we're kind of about to submit it to a journal, where we looked at different dimensions of place attachment. It's something that you see very often is people focus on natural place attachment. It's an easy one to go, oh, you find the natural environment important. So if you find that important, you usually would support some kind of conservation measures. But what we found in the first study was that people also had a sense of economic place attachment. It's something you never see that in the literature, because economic place attachment usually gets replaced by economic valuation. So then you put a number on it. You say it's worth this much. But we found there's also a sense of economic place attachment has nothing to do with money, which is weird. But it means that people are attached to economic activity. So they might have nothing to do with economic activity in the bay. They might not be fishermen. They might not have a tourism business. They might have no financial or economic connection to that activity, but they just like standing on the shore and seeing ships go by. And it's really important to people. And they'll do anything to defend that, even though they don't stand to make any money off of it. But it does mean that if it comes to the question of what do you think should be done in the bay, they will support economic activity through and through. So that's really interesting, and it hasn't been studied really. So that's what we did in the follow-up study. We're still kind of doing that. So we're trying to continue that kind of, not only that kind of research, but also that relationship with the communities around Dundalk. So not just going in and taking what we want from that, but continuing that conversation and building on previous research in order to create some community input into how that day is being governed. And that's the Blue4All research that we're doing at the moment. If anyone wants to look it up, it is on the website, Carbon and Marine Sediments, Dundalk Bay Potential Climate Litigation. It's a policy brief. Sorry, I forgot the hard copies, but it is there online. And yeah.
No,
Thanks very much.
Wow. That's all very impressive. And I have to say, my overarching feeling is I take great heart from all of you young people. I just love what you're doing, and I think the world's in safe hands, really. Do you have any questions? Anybody? Right.
No, I don't have a question, it's just an observation to make. But of course, obviously, the value of free science, I have an agenda, and taking stock of the whole situation. If I go back 2000 to 2000 BC, I believe the water level was 14 feet lower than what it is now. That's the height of the ceiling. So the whole water table level is lower than it is now. And as he said in the old Gaelic tale, Valar sent his herdsmen down, and he could walk from more mountains across Dundalk Bay, onto the Rockabillies, down to Dalkey Island, and into Wicklow, his homestead, without getting his feet wet, because it's all dry land. Now, can an economic value be put on all that land that's taken away from that line down to where we are today, where the water is 12 to 15 foot higher? And if an economic value can be put on that, all that land gone, all the economic activity gone, all that probably where the forest is in Dundalk Bay, or where the material is down in the bay, the muds, the shales and the sand, it's probably a lake previously there that if the water drained would come bogland. But seeing as it's not there, it's left in that state. And having said that, once that valuation is done, now that we're at 2024, can a valuation be put in 1,000 years' time, or maybe 100 years' time, when we've lost the same amount of land again on the inside, inshore, maybe 1 kilometre, 2 kilometres, and what the economic value of that is, and what it is? Because what they said was, in their economic value, that it's worth 33 billion, 33 trillion in earth value of the whole world. What is the value for Ireland as a percentage of that, and what is the value that will be lost in the next 100 years, even at 1,000 years, if they could do the calculation?
Yeah, well, look, I don't have the answer for it today, but I do accept what you say, that the environment is changing all of the time, and what exists today is not the same as what was there 2000 BC. There are different reasons for trying to do the valuation. You know, it's not just about, you know, what have we lost? It's about how influencing how we behave today, really, isn't it? And it's
how we
more,
can keep, you know, we have lost, but we can keep. So
Oh,
it's
yeah.
existing, we can
respect,
keep.
respect.
You know what, how to keep it at the maximum, like, maybe we won't lose the dollar in 100 years' time, 1,000 years' time. Maybe we'll hold ground and keep what we've got, rather than losing it.
Well, maybe we'll see. Any more questions?
Yes, there's one question on the chat, I
Okay.
believe, for
Going to read
for
it.
Thomas.
You can read it if you want.
Will I read it to everyone?
Yeah, do.
Question for Thomas: how do the marine settlement areas overlap with the planned marine protected areas and the new designated wind energy marine areas? And was there much awareness among the Dundalk community about either of these two types of marine developments? I can answer that.
I answer that, actually.
Yeah, go on.
Where do you think the carbon comes from?
It's a combination of so where does the carbon come from? It's a combination of sources. It's fertilizer runoff.
Yeah.
So a lot of it comes off the land through the rivers, through the catchment, into the catchment area.
Right, okay.
And then there's also
Some originating in the sea.
some of it does. So there's marine species that die and break down over time. So fish, algae, etc. They break down and they settle on the but Doris actually knows.
Yeah, no, they decompose, but that's definitely true, yeah.
So there's different sources.
Yeah.
There's also a lot of agriculture. In terms of how does it overlap? So Dundalk Bay is an SAC and an SBA, which is two types of protected area under European legislation, and they cover most of the inner Dundalk Bay, including most of the sediments. Although like that runs out pretty far. The government is currently, well, it's a little bit on the back burner now that there's an election, but they are working on a marine protected area bill, which will start designating marine protected areas around Ireland. So technically, there are no marine protected areas around Ireland at the moment. There are only SACs and SPAs and I think one marine park. They've drawn up plans for the Irish Sea, in which they try to incorporate the existing protected areas into a network of new marine protected areas that are bigger. But what they've done is to try and not put too much pressure on other things, is they've mapped all the other activities. So they've looked at where are the plans for the wind farms, where are the current fishing activity, and how can we navigate that in such a way that they can coexist alongside each other. Now, this next exercise you can't do forever. As you protect more of the sea, at some point you're going to have to make hard decisions. But it has largely, in the protected, you can Google this, it's a Department of Housing document. It's largely successful the way they propose it, where something like, say, the Nephrops fisheries, the Dublin Bay Trawler fisheries, are pretty much entirely unaffected. They are the most valuable fisheries in Ireland. So they are pretty much entirely unaffected by the proposed marine protected area. That being said, marine protected area does not necessarily mean you can't fish. There are different levels of marine protected area. And it doesn't always mean that everything is forbidden. The higher the level of protection, and the government has to decide that, the higher level of protection, the less you're allowed to do. In terms of the sediments, the fisheries in Dublin Bay would be sediment disturbing. Cockle and raised plant fisheries are dredging fisheries, but they are currently allowed under a quota system. So at the moment, that's the system, and the government has to decide how they manage that going forward. Was there awareness? I think that was the end of the question. There is awareness, some awareness in the community, at least of the wind farm. Like the wind farm is sort of, it's been in the works for 20 years. So people are aware of it. They're waiting for it to happen. But it is technical, right? It requires a lot of knowledge of what happens when and who gets what permits. So I do find a lot of people asking, and that do end up asking me questions about what is going on in terms of explaining to me how all this works.
I hope you are participating in the drafting of that marine protection bill or that.
And so not me personally, but given that one of the nice things about Ireland is such a small country is that the line's very short, right?
Yeah.
So one of the professors here in UCD would also be multiple professors here in UCD. Actually, some of the people our bosses basically tend to be involved in the marine protected area and research and communicate directly with the government in making suggestions or giving advice. So we do, in that sense, it does filter in, it does filter some upwards.
And I just wondered, Dorothy, about your work. Sorry, I'm not pronouncing this now, but I just wondered about the wealth of the ecology.
Yeah.
And I just wondered, does it increase nearer it comes to the coast, or is it more wealthy out in the deep ocean?
Based on like very, very initial and very careful assessments, I'd say there's really not that much difference.
Okay.
Actually, you can find kind of areas, I would say, very high ecological importance and function very close to the coast, but also pretty much far offshore as well, because there's offshore mud that is also important for like many processes happening and supports lots of communities of animals, of invertebrates, etc. So it's I wouldn't say there's like a very huge difference in any of that, but obviously there are also like kind of difficulties related to data, because we don't have always like this perfect coverage of everything. So what we are getting sometimes is really like a glimpse into like particular area. Like we don't get like a perfect vision.
And then Dr. Ashley, I was thinking of oil rigs. I mean, have you been on an oil rig to talk to?
No, but that would be fun.
And I was thinking, you know, fishing communities, they must be similar to coal miners. I mean, they were very attached to their environment as well, even though we might not think it's so pretty or so attractive, but that was their sense of place. And there was tremendous trauma when they had to close the mines and, you know, there must be parallels there. Maybe something you can learn from that. I don't know.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting observation, and I haven't studied coal mines at all or oil rigs. But an interesting thing to point out is that, would say with coal mines, the physical environment is quite different, and it might seem a little more inhospitable to human activity in different ways than maybe a sea environment. Because when you're underground in a mine, it's quite dark, I'm assuming, and quite black and dirty and very bad for the lungs as well.
It's their sense of place.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing.
Oh, 100%. Yeah, but in terms of connection to the natural world as well, it might be a different material, I guess, that's underpinning that connection.
And it's also about building and all the rest of it as well.
Yeah.
Very common.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, I was wondering, sort of everyone, what context is given to sort of like historical ecology of these areas, because I come from England, which is an incredibly degraded environment because of agriculture, and it's reflected in the sea. Are English seas are unnatural environments because they're so heavily fished and dredged. If you look back through historical records, you'll find that the water was 7 foot clearer about 200 years ago because of these mussel beds that have been removed. And so when it comes to issues of conservation, are you trying to, in a way, conserve actually quite an unnatural environment as opposed to trying to protect the natural historical processes that sort of feed these ecosystems?
Well, I don't know, Thomas, if you want to take that on. I mean, the government is trying to draft this policy to protect areas and is trying to limit further degradation, I would say, is that it? I mean,
But one of the issues you have with marine protected areas is they'll often just be designated lines on the map. There won't actually be any protection for the areas, and often they're established in areas to avoid conflict with other sectors, and so you're protecting an area which no one uses anyway. And protection is ultimately a trade-off. You know, if you're protecting a bay that fishermen don't get to, even protected biodiversity, you're not really adding value to conservation of the region. You do appease all the parties, but it doesn't ultimately provide a net benefit to your ultimate goal.
I think one of the things that factors into this as well, with George referring possibly to a bit as well, is the issue of shifting baseline syndrome, which what constitutes your baseline for a healthy environment. So if you ask a 40-year-old fisherman, what you know, you might say, when I started 20 years ago, that's when fishing was good, right? But if you ask a 70-year-old fisherman, when I started 50 years ago, it was even better, right? So, and that'll often, if you look at historical records, is the chief scientific advisor on Blue Planet, Colin Roberts in the University of New York, I think.
He was my master's supervisor.
Well, so George knows more about this again than I do, but he done some really interesting research using historical sources to find that if you go 200 years back, 300 years back, that's when the abundance of fish species, and maybe we shouldn't be trying to set today as a baseline, because today's marine environments are heavily depleted marine environments. Like, they're not healthy. Like you say, England's waters are now not natural by any means. But the challenge with that is you have to reckon with a lot of interest, as you say, and it's not possible to simply say to the fisheries, well, that's it then, stop fishing for the next 20 years, because that is livelihoods, and you have trickle-down effects. There are people who then work in warehouses, and then in the fish trade, and then there's trickle-down effects throughout the economy. And there are historical connections of people fishing in areas such as Dunlop Bay. And I did the research there. People would say one of the reasons they were so attracted to economic activity, even though they didn't make any money off of it, saying there's been a port in Dundalk for the last 500 years. And it's characteristic for the environment. The Clonaclose Dundalk port. And Dundalk port is basically, there's like 1 or 2 ships a month that go in. It's very hard to get in, because the clearance between the bottom of the ship and the seabed is 10 centimeters. There's only one pilot who can bring the ships in, and he's retired. So he still does it, but nobody else is willing to do it, because it's very hard to do. So it's not a port that's really viable, yet it's really important for people that stays active. So you have to reckon with all these interests, and that makes it really challenging.
And then, of course, there's the other thing is, like, just as we heard cattle to make a profit thing, do we heard sea life to actually make a profit? In other words, do we look from the birth to actually where they migrate to, how they get feeding, what it is, and is there stewards making sure that that environment is pristine for them so that they will thrive rather than end up as an extinct species? And only humans can do that.
The global target is 30 by 30. It's 30% of the world's oceans protected by 2030. Once you start going into a really large number of protected areas, then you will create those spaces, right? But you need a lot of coverage.
Hopefully. What I mean, is there stewards of it?
Oh, that's the next question, right?
okay, will we leave it at that? Do we have more questions on that?
Nothing on the chat.
No. Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody, for coming.
Thank you very much. I hope you think that was worth doing.
Yeah.
Mute.